good information, give new information that increase the information in the genome. Well, a few decades ago, as people began to discover the structure of the DNA, and they understood that DNA gives information for the building of protein, but only a very tiny percent of our DNA codes for protein. Just a few percent. Proteins like keratin in our fingernails and hair and hemoglobin in our blood, those are proteins. And only a little bit of our DNA codes for protein. And so evolutionary scientists back then said, oh, the rest is junk. It's junk DNA. Because they know that most of these mutations are harmful. They go downhill. They don't provide new, good, useful information. And so they said, all the rest is a leftover from our evolutionary past. It's junk DNA. And that's more or less what a mutation is. It's where, in the copy, one of the letters, one of the nucleotides, has gone wrong. And so that gave rise to the idea of junk DNA. And pseudogenes as well. Evolutionary scientists saw that in the genome are lots of things, sequences, genetic sequences that look like genes, but they don't appear to code for anything. They don't seem to be doing anything. And so they call them pseudogenes. Again, leftovers from our evolutionary past, just junk leftovers. And this is the idea of people like Francis Collins of Biologos. And he says humans share the same pseudogenes with some of the apes. And that, he says, is evidence that we're related to apes a few 100,000 years ago, or ape-like creatures a few 100,000 years ago, along with modern apes also descended from those ape-like creatures. Well, guess what? God doesn't make junk. We're increasingly finding that all of that DNA, all of those genes have purpose, have design, have use. There's a newish area of science called epigenetics. And it began after the Second World War. In the Second World War, in Holland, they experienced something called the Dutch hunger winter. They were blockaded for a few months. No food was going in. About 20,000 people died in an area through starvation. And after the Second World War, the mothers that were pregnant during that hunger period of a few months, scientists began to monitor their babies. And they found that their babies were smaller than the rest of the Dutch population, even though the mothers had started eating normally again after the war and the babies were born after the war. And that's maybe not so surprising. The mothers were starved, were lacking in nutrition, that their babies were smaller than the average Dutch population. But they carried on following them up, and into the following generations, in other words, the grandchildren of those mothers. And they found that they also were statistically different from the rest of the Dutch population. And they began to see that in response to that starvation period, certain genes had been switched on or switched off. And more research was being done on different creatures, seeing that certain genes are either switched on or switched off in response to our environment, the climate, food availability, and so on. And this is called epigenetics. Here's an Australian, he's an evolutionist, he believes in evolution. He makes the statement, the climate record shows that very rapid change has been a persistent feature of the recent past. And organisms would need to adapt to these changes in their environment equally quickly. Standard mutation and selection processes are likely to be too slow in many of these situations. In other words, there are genes sitting in our genome just waiting for a certain environment in order to switch on to enable a creature to adapt and survive in that new environment. Now, it's hard enough to think that that process of natural selection, survival of the fittest, random mutations over vast periods of time would create these 3.5 billion bits of information in the genome. But there's even information there that isn't even doing anything yet. It's sitting there waiting to enable us to survive in the right environment. And they're finding this in worms and mice and all sorts of creatures, this other level of information. Isn't that astounding? Isn't that remind us of the glory and the wonders of of our Creator God. Do you know that not only that, but scientists recently have found that our DNA speaks 2 languages. It doesn't only contain the recipe for making proteins for our bodies. It also, the exact same codons, the same genetic words, also give instructions for controlling of the genes. It's almost like getting an instruction book that tells us how to manufacture a computer, and those same words speak a different language that tells us how to operate and program that computer. That's what they are finding in the genome of living creatures and the DNA of living creatures. Absolutely astounding. Here's a scientist who said the failure to recognize the full implications of this, particularly the possibility that the intervening non-coding sequences may be transmitting parallel information in the form of RNA molecules, may well go down as one of the biggest mistakes in the history of molecular biology. So what's he saying? That notion that most of the DNA was junk will probably go down as the greatest mistake ever made in molecular biology and possibly in science. And it held back science for decades because people believed that that was useless leftovers of our evolutionary past. Well, if these mutations create new information that makes evolution possible, then surely somebody like Richard Dawkins, he's probably the high priest of evolution today, most famous evolutionist in the world, should know of an example where these copying errors, these mutations, have provided new, useful information.
Can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Can you just stop that? I think.
So I asked them to stop the camera.
There's a popular misunderstanding of evolution which says that fish turned into reptiles and reptiles turned into mammals, and so somehow we ought to be able to look around the world.
So he asked him to switch the camera off. He waited, continued to think for a few minutes, asked him to switch it back on, and then he gave an answer that didn't answer the question. He went off on a tangent. That is the most famous evolutionist in the world today, and he could not give one example of where these random mutations had led to new, useful information, more complex, specified information in the genome. See, the Bible tells us that we are fearfully and wonderfully made by God. And there's not only this information in the DNA and the nucleus, which is there in the middle of every cell, but there also has to be something there that is able to decode that information, the DNA code, to decode it and to put it into operation and carry out those instructions. And that is the cell. And you know, the cell is like a massive city. It's got power stations, it's got communication networks, transport networks, quality control procedures, all sorts of things going on in the cell, taking that information in the DNA and then applying it and creating new cells and creating proteins and so on. The idea that this happened by random processes of time and chance is just ridiculous. This is something that goes on in every single cell in every life form. It's called the kinesin motor. Kinesin motor, it's a protein. This is going on millions of times in cells. And what it's doing, this protein, it's got 2 feet and 2 hands there, and it's carrying a bag of proteins inside the cell to a destination. And these little pegs in that bag of protein it's telling it where to go. It's telling it where to go. And these microtubules, these little highways, roll out in front of the kinesin motor, and they dissolve again after it. That's going on, and we're looking at it in slow motion. That's going on at an incredible pace all over the human cell, taking these proteins to different parts of the cell. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. ATP synthase. ATP is the fuel of life. Every single process going on in our bodies requires ATP, this fuel. And then there's a little motor called ATP synthase motor. It's an enzyme that produces this fuel.
The animation is based on an incredible series of scientific discoveries. Only the colors show artistic license. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is the energy currency of the cell. ATP is produced by a tiny molecular rotary motor, rotating at up to 7,000 RPM. These are so small that 100,000 would fit side by side in a millimeter. A current of protons drives the motor, unlike man-made electric motors which use electrons. This portion of the enzyme is where adenosine diphosphate is combined with a phosphate ion in the presence of a catalyst to produce ATP, which is then released, making way for the next cycle. A top view of the enzyme shows the sequential operation. Almost every biochemical process in your body requires ATP.
Let's keep moving so that I can still keep some time to speak about dinosaurs later on. So these amazing things we're being told happened as a result of millions of years of random processes. And what does that idea of evolution say about who we are? See, the Bible tells us very, very strongly and powerfully who we are. The Bible tells us that we're created in the image of God. We're something like the amazing, genius, intelligent designer, creator God of the Bible. That's why we laugh and love and sing and communicate and invent things and do all these amazing things, creative artwork and so on, is because we're created in the image of the God that did those things that we've been looking at. But evolution tells us something very, very different about who we are. There's a man, Bill Provine, a well-known evolutionist at Cornell University. He says evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear there are no gods, no purposes, no goal-directed forces of any kind, no life after death. When I die, I'm absolutely certain that I'm going to be dead. That's the end for me. No ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning to life, and no free will for humans either. How does he get out of bed in the mornings? But you know, that is a logical deduction from the idea that we got here by random processes over millions and millions of years. And you guys are being taught this today in school and university. There's a couple of classmates speaking between classes, and he says to her, "You seem a bit down. Your science class went on for ages. What happened?" Teacher said, "We're nothing special. We came from pond scum. We're just evolved apes." That's what evolution does teach us. Her other friend says, "What are they teaching in your next class?" Self-esteem. You see, we don't get the message that we should love ourselves and have a healthy self-image and love our neighbors and respect others from evolution. It cannot give us that. But the Bible tells us who we are, created in the image of God, fallen in the image of our ancestor Adam. But we are unique. We're different from the animal kingdom. So then, a major problem with evolution as well is the problem of death. And this goes back to that challenge that I spoke about at the beginning, where the Bible says that therefore just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. What came first, sin or death, according to Paul? Sin. Paul says sin came first before death. When did God say that His creation was very good? Beginning, the middle, the end. The sixth day, when God finished creating, including creating the first man and the first woman, He looked at it and He said, "It is very good." Well, the problem is that if God used evolution to create, if evolution is true, and we still want to somehow believe in God, so He used evolution to create, it means that God was looking at a finished creation, including the first man and the first woman, and the Garden of Eden was sitting on these rock layers, which according to the evolutionary interpretation are a record of pain, death, disease and suffering over millions of years. And God looked at that and said, "It is very good." Who of you here think that death is good? Death stinks. Whether it's a loved one or even a loved pet, our hearts tell us it's not meant to be that way. And you know, the Bible agrees with us, God agrees with us. The Bible calls death an enemy, to be destroyed. And remember, we spoke about the future time, restoration and consummation, where there will be no more death. Well, why would God call death an enemy if that's the process that He used? Millions and millions of years of death, suffering, cancer, carnivory, in order to create. What about what Jesus taught? Salvation is through faith in Jesus Christ as our Savior. When He was challenged about marriage, He said that God made them male and female. And He quoted from Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. He said He made them male and female from the beginning of the creation. So there is Jesus speaking there at the beginning of the creation, about 4,000 years prior to that. In other words, in the creation week, and that sixth day, God made them male and female. Well, if evolution is correct, is true, Jesus was wrong. He should have said billions of years after the Big Bang, God made them male and female. Not at the beginning of the creation. Was Jesus wrong? Was He misguided? Was He lying? Of course not. He is the Creator Himself, and He knows what He's talking about. What about who Jesus is? The Bible tells us, it gives us His ancestry. In the book of Matthew, we have His legal Jewish ancestry through His father Joseph, going back through many of the kings of Israel, through David, and back to Abraham. But in the Gospel of Luke, we have His biological ancestry through His mother Mary, the seed of the woman. Remember back in Genesis chapter 3, God promised that the seed of the woman would crush the head of Satan. And so we have His biological ancestry going back through His mother Mary, through David, Abraham, all the way back to Adam. If evolution is true, Adam and Eve never existed. They're just some kind of mythical creatures. But you see, the Bible is true. We're all dying because we're related to Adam and Eve. And we needed somebody like us to die on the cross in order to have victory over the curse and over the fall. And so God Himself came into the universe, took upon Him the form of a man, that He could die in our place as our kinsman redeemer, our family redeemer. And if evolution is true, that is all undermined. It undermines our belief and faith in who Jesus is. We're going to look at the subject of dinosaurs just now. I'm going to quickly finish off here. But just some of our other resources. We've just launched this book, Evolution's Achilles Heels. This was 9 of our PhD scientists cooperated and wrote this book. It's got a chapter for a number of different fields of science that claims to prove evolution. Natural selection, genetics, radioisotope dating, and it totally destroys the so-called proofs for evolution. That's also available in a DVD, and we've got 15 PhD scientists that take part in that DVD. Tremendous graphics, wonderful film footage, interviews with scientists, an outstanding DVD. The Creation Answers book, it answers the 60 most asked questions regarding origins. Outstanding book. Is ook in Afrikaans beskikbaar. Ons het ook pakkies, afslagpakkies, 2 boeke en DVD vir R200. Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome, Dr. John Sanford. He's a very, very well-known geneticist. He invented the gene gun, and he showed how our genes are declining. Do you know, every single generation of human being, we get between 100 and 200 new mutations from our parents that they never had. And we will pass on between 100 and 200 new mutations to our children. Things are going in the wrong way. Evolution calls for things to be getting better and better, for new, useful information. They're going in the opposite direction. We're heading for error catastrophe. Remember, as long as we don't get the same mutations from our mom and dad, Normally things are fine, but eventually we are building up more and more and more of these mutations every single generation. And outstanding book that he's written there. How do we get our Bible? Some of our booklets, little Bible, booklet for 20 Rand, The Greatest Show on Earth, The Greatest Hoax on Earth. I spoke to you about Jonathan Sarfati, one of our full-time scientists. He wrote this in response to Richard Dawkins' book, The Greatest Show on Earth, which Dawkins believes to be evolution. Gay marriage, right or wrong? A very biblical, balanced look at that very, very topical subject, also for 20 Rand. Why does a good God allow bad things? A DVD answering that question that we spoke about earlier. And then outstanding children's books as well, but none of you are that young. Creation Pack, 490 Rand, a whole lot of books and DVDs. Christianity for Skeptics, Darwin, The Voyage That Shook the World. It's an info movie, it's a docu-movie. It acts out parts of his voyage on the Beagle, also interviews a lot of scientists, and a very interesting DVD. And then we have our own scientific journal, Journal of Creation. Just about probably all of our scientists that work for us full-time and support us around the world have published in secular magazines like Nature and Science and so on. But if any of them do any research or try and publish anything that speaks of belief in an intelligent designer or of a recent creation, they will not get published in a secular magazine. And so we have our own peer-reviewed creation science journal as well. Okay, that's it for the first part. We're going to take a break and then we'll speak about dinosaurs in the next section.
Great. Can we give Marc a big hand?